We need to allow every feeling, I believe, the dignity of its existence. Hi, I'm Sharon Salzberg. I am a meditation teacher. I've been teaching meditation for over 45 years now and practicing for over 50. I just had a recently published book, which is my 12th book. It's called Real Life.
And I'm really excited to be here with you today talking about real life. I'm Jud Brewer. I'm an addiction psychiatrist and a neuroscientist professor at Brown University and also the chief medical officer at Sharecare. So I get to be the interviewer. This is awesome.
I know, isn't it great?
Yeah, why don't we get started? So there's this idea around growth mindset versus fixed mindset. So Carol Dweck did some really seminal work decades ago that has just built over the decades around this mindset. And I think it's even become more of our vernacular today. I certainly use it. It's also where you open your book. So I'm wondering if you could explain to us what are these two mindsets and why you're starting there.
Yeah, I should actually start with the subtitle of the book, because that lays out the arc of the journey. And the subtitle is The Journey from Isolation to Openness and Freedom. And that's where I started thinking about growth mindset and fixed mindset and how, we can feel stuck, we can feel trapped. And I also want to say that when I talk about constriction or that early place, which so many of us experience, it's not about being intentional and determined and one-pointed. It's really about feeling trapped and feeling overwhelmed. And sometimes that feels like we feel stuck, we identify with that place, we don't have a sense of possibility or movement or growth. And the contrast to that is growth mindset. And Carol Dweck uses a very funny example, like thinking, well, this is the hand I've been dealt. This is the hand of cards I've been dealt. And maybe I'll pretend it's better than it is, but this is what it is, as compared to this is the beginning of the play, or this is an intermediate stage of the play. There are things to try. There are ways to experiment. There's possibility here, and that would be growth mindset.
I love that. And with this, this is the hand that we've been dealt versus, I'm going to kind of want this or pretend this to be the way it is. I love the title, real life. So, how can we be bringing that mindset into like just seeing what is real and what is true, and how does that actually build on a lot of the seminal writing that you've done over the years?
Well, I start the book really and the consideration, the examination from that place of constriction. So when do we tend to feel most trapped or overwhelmed? And of course it's quite personal, but I think there are also some fairly universal things, like when we are overwhelmed with fear, for example, or craving, as so evident in your work. When we feel like possibility is gone, that, and especially when we feel isolated. So I try to look at all of that with some view of sometimes we experience these things about ourselves, maybe our level of fear or anxiety, and we really are ashamed, we're dismissive, we want to hide it, we feel bad about it, rather than considering it a state of suffering and realizing that, if I look at it that way, there may be ways of approaching it, not trying to annihilate those feelings or make them go away, but more skillful ways of approaching them so that I can move through to a better place, one that's more expansive and connected and loving and so on. And that's a fascinating thing because it's so different.
Let's make sure that everybody is grounded in really understanding what you're meaning by fixed versus growth mindset versus contracted versus expanded. Certainly you and I have talked about this before, but let's make sure everybody understands this. So experientially, how would you help people feel into their direct experience of what expanded and contracted feel like?
It's almost like this little pivot. When we have a strong emotion, for example, our attention, our interest, even our fascination is tending to go toward the story, the incident, the comment that got us going, whatever it is. If it's desire or craving, then we fixate on the object or the person or the experience. If only I had this. And so the first thing we ask people is not to be so concerned in this exercise with what the story is or the object or the thing we want, but almost like turn our attention around, like, what does it feel like to want something so badly? What does it feel like to be that afraid? Not necessarily considering what you're afraid of and what you're going to do about it for now, for this exercise. What does it feel like? And that usually involves getting familiar with that feeling in our bodies, and also noticing how we are approaching it, noticing the spirit with which we are relating to it. Do we feel embarrassed about what we're feeling? Do we feel impatient? Do we feel a sense of compassion? Can we actually change the vocabulary that we're using in our heads from bad and wrong and terrible to painful? Then what happens? So we're really looking, almost you could say, at the holding environment, or the space around the original experience. And that's really a tremendously rich area for our work, because we need to allow every feeling, I believe, the dignity of its existence. And not say I'm like pathetic because I'm angry or whatever, but to recognize it for what it is and see if we can find the place, and we can actually, through training, find the place that is neither overcome by it and completely like drowning in it, and also not shunning it and pushing it away and trying to deny it. So it's like saying, this is what's here right now. And in that process, employing, as you would often talk about, I believe, curiosity and interest, and a kind of spaciousness and kindness that allows us to go deeper and to see more clearly different feelings that may be in that original feeling, and allows us to learn different things about ourselves. And that's really what's most critical.
And so with the judgment, does the judgment kind of change allowing those emotions to have their dignity? What happens with the judgment?
Oh, the judgment can take a nap. The judgment can take a rest. I mean, it's a very delicate place, which is why I think it takes some time. It takes some application to kind of feel our way into that place, because allowing the feeling to be there also might not mean letting it dominate, letting it drive you into action. It's like, despite the world's pronouncement that we're afraid of the unknown, which of course is also true, and true for me as well, I'm mostly afraid when I think I do know and it's going to be really bad. And it's all the stories I pile up. Like when we go back to New York City, I haven't been in my apartment in so long. I'm going to turn on the faucet. Didn't I read somewhere you can get Legionnaire's disease from turning on a faucet? What about it? How am I going to know? Maybe I'm going to get it. I'm like, right? That's when I get really afraid. And even in the midst of that kind of arc, if I remind myself, you know what? You don't know. I feel relief. I feel space. And so that was a important insight I got about my own experience of fear from observing it. It's not like we want to kind of acknowledge and even accept the feeling so that I can, have us move before we even get back to New York, but so that we can have a greater understanding.
Kind of building on that a little bit, I'm thinking about, you're saying paying attention to the fear. And to me, from a scientific standpoint, fear is this helpful survival mechanism in the moment, right? If there's a bus bearing down on us, we need to do something. You're describing, if I'm hearing it correctly, when there's fear of the future, oh, what's going to happen when my faucet turns on? You're not turning on the faucet right now. It's just this mental kind of a time travel into the future. So fear of the future, which actually, I think of fear of the future as anxiety, where the manifestation shows up as, it's like, there's nothing I can do about it right now except get more afraid and more anxious by spinning out in the story of, oh no, oh no, oh no, oh no. Does that fit with what you're describing?
Yeah, very much so. I think of my friend, my colleague, Sylvia Borstein, who describes herself as a recovering catastrophizer, which is actually how she became interested in meditation practice, because she was suffering, and I believe her relationships were also suffering. She describes herself as the kind of person, she's 86 years old now, who will call her adult child who doesn't answer the phone. So her mind immediately goes to the worst must have happened. As she puts it, I never think maybe they're taking a shower, or maybe they fell in love, they don't feel like talking to their mother. She got into meditation practice, which I think has not annihilated those thoughts, which is an important point, but she has so much more space from those thoughts. And she knows, just as you say, not necessarily true. Let's check it out.
So this makes me think of, if I remember correctly, and I may be mispronouncing these, but there are these Buddhist concepts, hiri and otapa, around like regret and remorse.
Yeah, yeah.
And it sounds like there's a difference between shame and what they're talking about is these things that are actually skillful and help us learn. So what's the difference?
To have a sense of what they call moral shame or moral dread is like having a sense of conscience. And there is a greater sensitivity, I think, through any kind of introspection. It doesn't have to be meditation. It could be journaling. It could be psychotherapy. It could be getting out in nature, but really looking at your own feelings and, so many possibilities. But through some kind of introspection, we often have that memory come up of like, oh, I said too much, or I said nothing. I wish I'd spoken, whatever it might be. And there is a certain pain or poignancy in that, like, ooh, if only I'd known better, I would have done better. But I couldn't in that circumstance. And so how do I learn? How do I change? And here too, the growth mindset is always prominent. Like, how do I change? And shame is considered a more wholesale condemnation, like I am a bad person. Not just that was reckless, or I think better of that now, but I am awful. I am basically only that act. Sometimes the worst thing we've ever done. Sometimes there's an obsession, as I'm sure you know and have witnessed, with what most people would consider fairly minor, but it's haunting somebody. And so the difficulty is that we think often shame is good. That's what we need. So it takes some introspection to notice, oh, there is another attitude I could have and cultivate. There's another spirit with which I can meet these very uncomfortable recollections, and that has the possibility of change and moving on.
One thing I'm hearing in that is a big differentiator between those two categories, let's say, of experience, is self. It's like, if we take something personally, I'm a bad person, you should be ashamed of yourself. We hear all these phrases related to the self. And certainly, it's funny because, we found, and you've even helped participate, donated your brain for some of our experiments. We found that these self-referential networks get really activated when people are caught up in self-referential things like craving or regrets, or, well, I wouldn't even say regret there. We didn't dial in on that carefully enough. But certainly when people worry a lot related to anxiety, it gets activated. As expert meditators' brains show the opposite, where they can notice these things, notice those thought patterns, notice the emotions, give them, if it's fair to say, give them the respect that they deserve, but not give them a pat on the back like, oh, that's me, that's who I am. I get a sense that the that's me, that taking it personally is where the differentiation lies. Is that fair to say?
I think it's very fair to say, and based on that differentiation, we may, in general, treat our mistakes or our falling down in some way as bad and wrong and terrible. We may treat it very harshly, or we might treat that moment with more compassion for ourselves, which also involves a certain understanding that that's not weakness or being dull-minded or something like that, or lethargy. It's actually a very dynamic state that does help us make change.
I think through a lot of this stuff, from a scientific mindset, and you're really bringing it into real life, from these experiential standpoints. I'm wondering if you could also, you're also, I would say, approaching it from a spiritual standpoint. Can you describe a little bit more, how the spirit meets the science, so to speak?
Yeah, well, I really appreciate tremendously and have great respect for the science. And I will say, Jud, you are the only scientist who's ever had access to my brain. So it was a great moment in time. And I hesitate even sometimes with the word spiritual, because people can have a lot of interpretations of that. But I think even going back to my example of looking at my own fear and seeing having some very personal insights about it, I think as we keep paying attention, certainly there are these personal insights. There are also kind of more universal insights. It's seeing how these emotions, for example, arise, and they seem so strong, and definite. But when you really look, oh, look, there are compounds. Like within that fear is a lot of loneliness, and within that anger is a lot of sorrow. And, and you kind of see the compound nature, and you see how everything is constantly changing. It's moving. It's evanescent. It seems so like it's etched in stone, but really look at it, and this is what we see. So we begin to see a world of constant change, and that has beauty to it, like renewal, opening, springtime, and always a sense of possibility. And it has what you can call poignancy to it, like nothing lasts, and part of that message, of course, is appreciate it now. This is not going to last, and our clinging is not going to make it last longer. And so there's some deeper kind of truths that just get revealed in the natural course of paying attention. And one of them is what I would consider maybe the most spiritual of all, and that is the truth of interconnection. We can feel, and often do feel, so alone and so cut off, so disconnected from others. And yet, if we actually looked, and not just from a spiritual perspective, from economics, certainly from environmental awareness, from epidemiology, which is something I've been saying for years, we're actually connected. We live in an interconnected universe. Like my favorite question, just about going into a company or an organization to teach, is how many other people need to be doing their jobs well for you to do your job well? Because the truth is, that's the nature of things. And it's fascinated me forever about meditation practice, because it looks like on the surface like it might be the most solitary activity ever. Like maybe you practice alone, maybe you practice with your eyes closed. But one of the things that just dawns naturally is this deep, deep knowing of how connected we all are. And so that is a kind of sense of belonging and a sense of meeting one another. That has nothing to do with liking everybody or even liking anybody, but bone deep knowing of that kind of connection, I would say is the most spiritual thing about meditation practice.
I love it. I love it. So more bite-sized wisdom from Sharon Salzberg. So I'd encourage everyone to go out and check out Sharon's book, Real Life. And Sharon, thank you so much for this conversation. It was delightful.